Gregg, an NFL Hall of Famer. So I'm going to kick it off to Dr. Okun to maybe talk a little bit about that head trauma piece.
Yeah. So, well, first, I love book clubs. I'm a reader myself, and so we can talk about a lot of other books too. And so it's obviously an honor to be here with PMD Alliance and talking about our book. And I think these discussions are formative and they should be fun. So if anybody's not having fun, raise your hand and tell us why you're not having fun, because book clubs should always be an interesting exchange. In terms of the issues, when we were writing and we were thinking about this idea of you hit your head, and when you hit your head, how in the world does that set you up to get Parkinson later, right? You start to think like, well, how do those two things go together? And, a couple of decades ago, when we were getting started in Parkinson, if you said to people, well, you hit your head and it has something to do with Parkinson disease, they'd say, Anissa, you're crazy. No, that's not true. It can't be. No, it cannot be. And it turns out that, year after year, we started to learn a lot more about head trauma. And we started to learn both in animal models, but also in humans, particularly humans who are going off to war and coming back, but also in humans that hit their head for various reasons. It could be the scooter in your driveway. It could be that you trip and hit your head. So there's a lot of different ways to hit your head, or it could be boxing. And there's been a lot that people have talked about with repeated blows to the head. And so we definitely have now accumulated enough evidence over several decades to know that there is a relationship. And so if we now kind of, accept that if you take a large group of people and you say who's exposed to different kinds of head traumas and who ended up getting Parkinson's disease, we've now seen enough repeated studies from multiple continents to actually believe this, that there's something there, that there is an association. Doesn't mean everybody who hits their head is going to get Parkinson's, absolutely not. But there's an association that your risk is more. And so people have talked about this as like maybe there's a second hit hypothesis, no pun intended, like where, let's say maybe your genetics and you might have a predisposition to getting Parkinson's disease. You hit your head, and that's what they call the second hit, that sets off some sort of series of events or a cascade that ends up leading to Parkinson. And so a lot of experts think that's true. And then the other aspect of this has been these NFL players turning in their brains when they're done with playing and different sports. And, Steve Dukowski, who's here at the University of Florida with me, was one of those original people. He was the chair at the University of Pittsburgh when they came into his office and they said, look at this great Dukowski. We call him great because he's a legend. They said, look at this under the, what do you think this is? The medical examiner, Malu Omalu, showed it to him, and he said, it looks a lot like Parkinson, or it looks a lot like Alzheimer's. It's not exactly like Alzheimer's. And that was the birth of the chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the CTE story. And so there is something about hitting your head that can set off these steps that we call cascades in science that can lead to cells dying, which are degenerative diseases like Parkinson and Alzheimer's. So we've evolved our thinking now that this can actually happen, and so it's been an evolution where we thought, no way, to not only do we believe it now, but now we're trying to figure out why it happens and who it will happen to.
And the book talked a little bit about the combination of head trauma and pesticide exposure tripling the risk of Parkinson's.
Yeah, so here now you get into this really interesting debate and this interesting concept. And I touched on it just for a second there, and that's the second hit, right? So everybody who has a gene that says they're going to get Parkinson disease doesn't get Parkinson disease. Let me say that again, okay? Just because you have a gene that says you're going to get Parkinson disease, we know that doesn't actually mean that 100% of those people get Parkinson disease. It's not 100% manifest destiny, okay? So there has to be something else. And that something else can be the environment, it can be head trauma, it can be multiple other things. And so over the past 2 decades now, we're beginning to understand beyond just the one hit. So maybe you hit your head, but maybe you hit your head and you get exposed to pesticide, or maybe you hit your head, you get exposed to pesticide and something else happens too. And that may add to the risk. And in fact, we do know from emerging studies and emerging data now that if you're exposed to several chemicals, your risk can be astronomical for getting Parkinson's disease. And so there can be an additive effect with some of these exposures. And it's certainly something that I think we should all care deeply about and trying to figure this out so we can try to limit this for the next generation.
Absolutely. I know there's a lot of work going towards, encouraging people to report now when they have concussions, and there's concussion programs, sports programs that incorporate that now. And I think we're definitely getting a better understanding. Somebody wrote in, they said, how about the third hit? And that's when you've already been diagnosed with Parkinson's and then take a bad fall and hit your head. Is there any concern with that?
Yeah, so I think that's an awesome people, the scientists talk about the second hit and causing it, but perhaps like the construct, whatever you call it, of the third hit, once you actually have something already, and then you get another insult on top of that, whether you get punched by a NISA or you fall or something else happens to you that provides, the third hit could make you worse. And we have seen this. And let me just build on that third hit hypothesis with people who already have it, whatever you call it, what that next thing that could make things worse, and you end up worse than when you started. And that is, we've learned from data that main issue is hospitalization. People go in the hospital, right? And they have Parkinson already, and they end up worse off. And so that would be kind of another one of those like third hits, like, okay, I've already got it. And now something about, this type of exposure, and which all the things you get exposed in the hospital and surgeries and everything, really makes it worse. And we just hear over and over people never getting back to where they were before. So it doesn't mean you shouldn't go to the hospital if you have a problem where you need the hospital, but we shouldn't be putting Parkinson folks in the hospital or keeping them there unnecessarily long if we don't need to. And so we need to utilize our clinics, make sure everybody's getting access, and stopping that, what I love that term, that third hit.
Yeah, that's a great one. And I had another really interesting question. Someone was wanting to know about psychological trauma. So we talked about head trauma, but is there any correlation to psychological trauma and developing neurological diseases?
Yeah, so much less known about that topic. But I would just invite people to open their minds to the possibility. And I'm sort of infamously known among the students for telling everybody that comes to see me in the clinic, I know less medicine every day. I know less every day. And it's true, because the denominator, the amount of information that's out there, keeps getting larger and larger, and my brain is small, right? So it's hard to see. I think we have to be humble about how much information we can take on. And so are we in a situation like we were 20 years ago where we said, no way, Anissa, there's no way that there's any relationship to head trauma? And now are we in a position where we're saying there's no relationship to psychological factors? Be careful. I think I would say be careful. I would say there's a few smaller studies, and there's people who believe this. But the belief at this moment, at least based on my opinion, is that it's right now it's more conviction than it is data, and that it's going to be a hard road to prove that. And if we can prove psychological, does impact in some way, causes a stressor that becomes the second hit, I think it's going to have to be a little more specific than psychological, because that's kind of like, what does that mean exactly? So, but let's say, like that means, that there's a specific inciting event, abortion, rape, trauma, something in the past, some of those things may very well line up as causing enough to create that second hit. So I wouldn't put it out of the question. I've been around long enough now to not to dismiss things anymore, or not to dismiss them too quickly.
Right. And it's very fascinating. So I kind of want to move into the topic of exercise and the role of that. So the book talks about Jimmy Choi, who I've had the opportunity to meet. He's just a powerhouse, and how he went from falling down the stairs with his young son to becoming an American Ninja Warrior. And not everybody's going to become an American Ninja Warrior, but just how much it has changed him. And also, there was that information about that Hallmark study that Jay Albert started just because he happened to do a tandem ride across Iowa with Kathy, and just how we figured out forced exercise can impact people with Parkinson's. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about Parkinson's, but I also want to kind of get into, can we prevent it with exercise?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and there's sort of a split on this among the experts. So there are a bunch of experts who believe very strongly that when you exercise, that it provides what's called symptomatic benefit. So your symptoms improve, and that's what we're seeing. But the disease itself doesn't change its course in any meaningful way. And in the guidelines and in the review articles that are coming out, whether you read JAMA or Lancet or whatever, they're all converging that that we concede as a field. And here's another 20-year change. We've now conceded as a field that exercise is helpful symptomatically. And notice I use that word concede, because it takes a scientist a while to decide, okay, I believe that, because scientists should be careful with putting their mark or their stamp on something. So then the question turns to the idea, could it slow the disease or change its progression in some meaningful way? And what we do know is, if you put little animals on treadmills and you start to measure them and do things in the laboratory, there's a good bit of evidence in the laboratory, right? And that's part of what's driven this, sort of, conversation. And people that do a lot of that, they have a lot of conviction, right? There's a famous Nobel laureate that said, the easiest person to fool is yourself, right? Because you make the experiment, you know what you want to see, so you're going to see what you want to see. It's the same true for those of you that have kids. It's the same thing with kids, right? Or you see what you want to see, and you don't see what you don't want to see. So we move into this really interesting area of, can we get beyond the conviction and start to get some science within humans? And the first sort of cut of the science that we talk about in the book is this idea that you take a whole bunch of studies and you mash them all together. And we call that a meta, M-E-T-A, a meta-analysis, okay? So you push them all together, and then you see, does it tell you something? And when you do that, there's a number of investigators that have done that with exercise, and you start to look at long-term outcomes. There's some suggestion that it might slow disease progression. Not a lot, not like it's going to stop this degenerative process, but maybe there's a little meaningful, change. And the biggest problem between a study like that and proving the science is, how does one in the human measure that? We don't cut your brain open and look like we do in an animal. Can't do that. Obviously, that would be unethical. So how do we do that? And so this is the crux. So this question is more about like, how do we make the progress in science issue than it is about the question. And it's having the right tool in our toolbox to be able to answer the question. And so we're going to keep having this circular debate until we come up with a way in humans to meaningfully measure this. And so that's where this idea of biomarkers and markers, and could it be scans that we look at, like souped up MRI scans, or blood markers, or markers of the fluid that bathes your brain, or some other way that we can actually tell, because these things your doctor does, when you see them, these tapping and everything, it ain't enough. These 0 to 4 scales, when they give you your score, it's nice to get a score, but it's not going to be enough to tell us, whether any of these therapies are meaningfully changing the course of the disease. And one other mind-blowing thing I'll just leave you with on this conversation is, it's very possible that we are doing things that are changing the course of the disease, and that we just don't have the sophistication yet to know. Okay. So just keep that in the back of your mind. We might catch up, and in the next 20 years, we learned so much about what we didn't know. In the next 20 years, we might look back and say, oh, I'm glad we were doing that, because that was definitely slowing down progression. So we're not there, but certainly, there's enough experts, weighing in on this, that there's a meaningful effect in affecting disease progression in Parkinson, that it should draw your attention. And it's up to the scientists to try to nail that down. And what does that mean? And how could that be important to people? But that one should draw your attention, Anessa, because there's something there that's interesting.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're getting a few questions. One of them, this person wants to know, and it's a little bit of a different perspective from exercise. This person's wanting to know, why does exercise help a lot of people, but others are so drained and fatigued after moderate exercise, like riding a recumbent exercise bike for 20 minutes? It's important, but some people are energized by it and others are very drained from that.
Yeah, so it's a very important question. And when we start to look into this, and as we were writing the book, we started to actually understand some things that needed clarity. And the first thing that was very clear to me was, like, we tell everybody to exercise. What does exercise mean to everybody? And then if you ask the majority of people in, let's say, America, I think most people on this call today are from America, but if there are people from other countries, it's probably true in other countries too. I can only speak from where I live. If you ask people, do you like to exercise? Most people are like, no, not really. Like, we do it because we need to do it. So we ask people to do something that they don't normally do or don't like to do, the majority of people. And so what does it mean? And then we start to put out all of this information. And so my good friend Jay Alberts has a great study from Cleveland Clinic where he forced exercise. He forced the revolutions in the bike, how fast the people would pedal. And he learned that by putting a person on his bike and biking across Iowa and realizing they did better when they were biking with him, and they got off and they looked better. And so everybody tried to start to do that experiment, and the people that volunteered to do his experiment did really well. And then everybody across America, when that paper came out, started to try this, and probably in other zip codes across the world. And people were wrecked. Some people were fatigued and just doing horrible. And we had to put out an immediate sort of like, hey, Jay Alberts, we love you. Nothing about Jay Alberts is wrong. Nothing about the experiment's wrong. But just please realize that the intent of you exercising isn't so you get wiped out. And so what I tell people is, sure, it's good to sweat, sure, it's good to exercise, but if you're exercising and it's wiping you out for the next day, then it's too much. So it has to be modulated. And sometimes with a personal trainer or a physical therapist, starting slow with just stretching at first, and working your way up to some things. And everybody's a little different. And it's not to say that everybody needs to be doing Olympic times. And in fact, I tell people this is not an Olympic sport at all. This is about like getting up and moving, like, so if you have somebody to walk with you to help so you won't fall, if you swim, always swim with somebody because there's an increased risk of drowning with Parkinson if you swim alone. So make sure you have a buddy when you're exercising, and it should not be fatiguing for you. And if it is fatiguing, you should do two things. One, talk to your doctor and your therapist about a different graded to see if you could be graded up. And it's just a matter of you need to kind of work your way up. Okay. That's the first thing. Okay. You should do. You should always like ask yourself that question, is this right? And the second thing is make sure you have a good primary care doctor, an internist, or a family physician, and let them know that, because every once in a while there is a heart issue, that needs to be taken care of, or there's some other issue that's going on. And I just remember getting an email from one of my patients. I saw him in the clinic here this past week, and every time I see him, he mentions this one thing to me that was like a 2-second response that I gave him on email changed his life, because he said, I'm having this thing, like this funny thing when I exercise. Is this Parkinson's? And I was like, no, I don't think so. Go see your doctor right now. Get in the car and go see your doctor right now. And he needed a cardiac stent, right? And so I think, you can't blame everything on Parkinson. Widen your mind out on this. If you're fatigued when you're exercising, we've learned that we really do need to cut back and think of a different strategy. It's not a one size fits all.
Fabulous. That's very helpful. And I know that question's come up before, so thank you for such a great answer to that. So I want to move into talking a little bit about diet, because I know this is something that people ask a lot about. So the book talks about the role of foods, maybe the Mediterranean diet, caffeine, how that plays a role. I'm getting some questions about this, how it's affecting progression, and your thoughts on things like organic foods and supplements.
Yeah, so like in general, healthy diets, great. Couple of tips that we give people based on the data. And so again, remember, we try to operate as scientists purely on data. When you see your team, which is not only has, a neurologist or psychiatrist or psychologist, but oftentimes has a nutritionist as part of the team as well. We're all just trying to give you as much advice as we can based on the data. And let's just be honest when we have these nutrition discussions. And I tell people we need to be honest. I tell the nutritionists that work here, 2 of them with us that do research too, let's all be honest and just realize we don't have a lot of this data. So people are guessing. So a lot of what you're getting from people are guessing. And so anything that you do that is tremendously, like onerous or nutty or crazy or, like seems over the top, always question it, because it might be that, that things are being overinterpreted. What we know now is that there are changes in what we call the microbiome, which is all the different bacteria and phages and viruses that live normally within your gut, okay? And that we can manipulate those in animals, and it can make a difference in our Parkinson experiments. Pretty interesting. We don't have any idea yet what that means in the humans, although there's been some provocative, interesting things about inflammation and about different things. If we take all the data that we have together and we smash it together, okay, into one of those meta-analyses, it seems that people who were eating Mediterranean diets do get Parkinson a little bit less, not a lot less, but a little bit less. But for those of you on the call who have Parkinson's disease, guess what? I don't mean to let the cat out of the bag, but you have Parkinson already. Okay, so all of these things, a lot of these studies that are risk studies are past you. Okay, the ship has sailed already. Okay, so you don't want to do something based on a risk study for your own life. Then in terms of thinking about what the diets are, there have been a few smaller studies suggesting maybe a Mediterranean diet, maybe flavonoids, maybe different things, but not a lot of robust data. And so when I see like all of these things, like world famous nutritionists and stuff telling everybody do all these things, I always say, like, hit the pause button. Like I tell my kids, let's hit pause. Okay. Let's think about this. You have Parkinson. If you have certain foods and certain things that you enjoy with your life, please let's not exclude things that can bring great joy and purpose to your life. One. Okay. So keep that as you don't have to be extreme in this. And then two, we're not sure whether organic is better or what organic and what natural means and as we drill into this, every company uses these words in different ways. So be careful. If you don't have Parkinson and you're concerned somebody in your family might get Parkinson because there's a risk, certainly wash your fruit, like Ray Dorsey says, because there is a pesticide to getting Parkinson risk. But once you have Parkinson, eat a healthy diet, okay? And sometimes you have to give your Parkinson meds a little bit of a head start. But I would say don't go over the top, like with some of these recommendations before all the data is there. Don't let it destroy your life. So if you have a certain type of food, like let's say Anissa loves croissants and I tell her you can't have croissants anymore. And I said that to me is a tragic ending to something where we don't have enough data to support that. And so I just tell people, let's go in moderation and then put it on people like me to do the studies, to get our nutritionists and our people in different research groups to do these studies, to inform you, to tell you what you need to do and what you don't need to do. So certainly eating a healthy diet, some evidence for the Mediterranean diet before Parkinson and maybe after Parkinson, some evidence for microbiome changes, some evidence for inflammation, and then the rest is a bit of an unknown. So, but exciting.
It is exciting. And, sometimes it's hard to even keep up with all of the stuff that we read about on an almost daily basis. So thanks for, summarizing that so well. All right, I want to move into the next chapter because there's so much material. I love this chapter talking about taking care. It seems like we're having more and more conversations now, which are great, about access to the specialist or even a neurologist, depending on where you are in the US or in other countries. Just so many countries that don't have access to the care they need and getting the diagnosis. So it goes through a lot of statistics and breakdown on that, and then goes into talking about care. You've already referenced hospitalizations and long-term care. So I want to go back to that and see if you could share a little bit about that. Like, I don't know that I have a specific question framed for that, but can you cover some of the things that's discussed in this chapter?
Yeah, so I'll tell you, like, when we were writing, things that like stood out in our discussions and our research. And so, in order to put together a book like Ending Parkinson, and I should mention there are 3 other co-authors, Todd Shearer, Boston Bloom, and Ray Dorsey. And it's a tremendous honor to write with them, but it's also a lot of fun to bounce and to argue. And I'll tell everybody else something shocking here. We all 4 of us don't agree on everything, right? And so, like, how about that? How's that for shocking?
So that makes it more fun.
Yeah. So you get 4 experts. You get 6 opinions, and there's only 4 experts. And we learned some things in writing the book. One was we dug in a little more to some of the work by Allison Willis, looking at how people access care, and this will use that word access, and I think it just gets more and more shocking the more we dig into that. And we know based on her work and others that have published in this area, that if you have a neurologist, your chances of morbidity, dying, mortality, right? Morbidity getting worse, mortality, dying, or going to a nursing home are much more if you don't have access to a neurologist. And it, not even a trained, much less a trained neurologist, somebody that has extra training in Parkinson and movement. And so we learned all about that and realized my gosh, how many people are not getting access? And there's a huge piece of the pie that just is not accessing therapy and even accessing basic specialists, not even the subspecialist, but just a neuro person, and how much that can make a difference in Parkinson. We learned that certain communities, regardless of zip code or country, are just not accessing the therapies. And so it's not an equal playing field for everyone when we look at medicines and surgeries. We learned that the average cost for a person and family with Parkinson, per month cost was astronomical for drugs, and for other things. And we learned that a lot of the things that you do every day have a cost associated to them. It costs you to fuel your car up. It costs you time out of work to get to a doctor's or a medical professional's office. And so, I would say, Anissa, like in writing in that portion of the book, there was there was a real sense of humbleness, like, oh yeah, here are all these smart people that have been in the field all this time, and we're doing all this stuff. And then we dig in and we realize people are not getting the therapies and getting the access. And even here, just to pick on this book club, so I'm going to pick on every person that's in the book club right now. You all are the vast minority. You're attentive. You come into the PMD Alliance. You get information. You go on Twitter. You go on Facebook. You talk to people. But you're in the elite few percent of folks and families affected by Parkinson. We have millions and millions of people that are afflicted all over the world and are just not even getting this amount of information. And you're going to do far better with your disease than these people. And the other thing that was just striking to me was how tragic of a diagnosis it is for so many people. And it's something I've written about for a long time, but the more I start to get into it, the more conversations I have, the more I just realize you go and somebody says, you have a disease. It's like a Mad Lib. You have this disease. And so here in this case, you have Parkinson's disease. It's a huge moment. Like, it's huge. And how that moment is handled is huge. And understanding like what you don't have, what your future is, how this is going to go. The people on this call, you all have a much deeper understanding, of this, because you've been engaged and you've gotten the right resources and you're thinking about it. But 90+% of people are not. Most people are not even getting a diagnosis worldwide from somebody who even has expertise in neurology, not even a neurologist. And it's just basically you have Parkinson, and it's like throw you in the pile with Alzheimer's and every other bad thing that you can think of. And so when we were writing on these chapters, our hearts were, heavy and somewhat broken, and just, like, it's humbling, right? To be in the field for so long, for so many years, and to think you're making a difference. And then you see the statistics and realize, how far up that hill we still need to go and how steep the hill is. So those were the things we were thinking about when we were writing in that part of the book.
And that is so true, because those numbers of those people that are not being reached, those are stories. Those are people's life story that's being impacted. Those are care partners and family members being impacted alongside them. And the book does go into a little bit about care partner burden. And I think the statistic quoted 40% of care partners report that their health has worsened and their social lives have suffered. And if that is the case with some support and some education, I can't imagine the impact that it has on those who don't have access to the care or the knowledge.
Yeah, that's right. And it's for lack of a better scientific term, it's mind blowing, Or
The other
mind
thing that
numbing,
blew
maybe
my
mind
mind, oh,
numbing would be the better neurological term. So
the other thing that blew my mind was the fact that 80% of our cares that Medicare and insurance is paying for is hospitalizations and nursing facility, and not for prevention, which would be a lot cheaper if we were spending more money on exercise and all of those things that would help people to live healthier and keeping them out of the hospitals and out of nursing facilities, and how we might be able to change that.
yeah, and speaking, of the idea of when you write these things, writing for me has always been reflective. It gives you a chance to reflect, to try to put things in perspective, to try to reprioritize, reoptimize your mind. And so, one of the things that we were all thinking as authors as we were writing was, we should be thinking like this more often, because maybe we're doing the wrong studies and talking to the wrong people, right? So now you think of all this great medical research, nothing against all this medical research, and not just in Parkinson, but in all these diseases. We're left with this feeling of, could we have designed those studies in a different way and pitched them to different people within the government authorities and the insurance companies? Could we have had a more productive upfront discussion before we went off and did all these creative things that would have helped more people in the long term? So, you have a bunch of scientists out there, and count me in this group, that are doing all this stuff. Some of us are super creative, some of us are a little crazy, we're spitballing, we're throwing all these ideas up against the wall. And then we're trying to publish, we're penning, we're trying to write it, publish it, get it out there. But the sense, Anissa, of what we were left with as we wrote this, and we wrote about this in the chapter, was, did we miss a lot of opportunities, not in the specifics of what we did, but in how we did it, how we approached it? And there's a kind of an important lesson, I think, in there that that we have to learn. And I know as a neurologist, we often say there's a term called prosody, like the emotional valence of something. And I always remind myself too, particularly a few times a year, it's not that you tell your wife that you love her, it's how you tell her you love her, right? So it's the how. And so it isn't that all the scientists weren't doing what they needed to be doing, but it's how they were doing it and how we executed. And then when we went back and we start to think about this and we start to kind of formulate, okay, what is the formula for success in Parkinson as we move forward, or another disease? And we think of that. And so this is a book club. So we think philosophically, like, what do we learn from this? I think we have to think about not the what, but how we were approaching it. And if we approached it a little bit differently, could we have had a more impactful outcome?
Yeah. The reflection is very helpful, I think, in the future, but that's something that we'll all continue to be doing as the years progress and we learn more and more about this. So I love how you're describing all this. I know that the people joining us today are also enjoying this. So I want to talk a little bit about, you mentioned some research, and I know that we've talked about in other venues like personalized medicine and research, and that kind of goes along with that. So I want to go into chapter 8. So you're talking about some emerging areas of research, including optogenetics, which all of this stuff is really, really above my head and maybe above some of the others, although we have some really smart people on here. But I want you to kind of go through and talk a little about maybe that and the LRRK2 targeted therapies, the treatments at GBA, some of those things. And the book does a great job, but we would love to hear from you what's coming down the pipeline.
Yeah, so it's humbling, right? Because even in the last 20 years, the number of ideas, the number of directions of research, the number of ways that experts are coming at the problem in different ways. You're hoping there's going to be convergence, like these things are going to converge, and we're going to come up with some big leaps. And so there's a lot of excitement in the field and trying to think through that big picture. And it's interesting because you first mentioned optogenetics, and it's a big word, first of all, and Carl Dieselroth and others have really pioneered this this technique. He's in Stanford and a great guy, a psychiatrist by training, actually. He runs a lab there. And if you look back in history, so after Watson and Crick won the Nobel Prize for DNA, they tend to talk about how people after they win the Nobel Prize go a little nutty, they're very creative and they go a little nutty. But if you look back in like Scientific American, some of the writings after that, there was a discussion. They brought up this idea of, could we be using light as therapy? And so what Carl Dieselroth and colleagues have done is they've been able to introduce light into the brain of animals. And they have these gene carriers that bring in different proteins and different things inside these animals. And when you expose light to them, you can control the different circuits of the brain really specifically. So like, imagine like you have a light switch, in your home, right? It's kind of on and off, right? That's control. That's kind of like basic control, right? And then they started to give you dimmers, right? And then they started to give you all these like, oh, I can control it from California and Australia when I'm on vacation, and I can turn this one on and I can make all these different colors. Now you can get to nanosecond control of things. And when you can do that in experiments, you can start turning on and off things and see what happens in a system. And so Carl and colleagues have really added a lot to our ability to understand more about the brain by using what Watson and Crick thought would be, sort of this idea of using light. It's not in a way I think they imagined, but you can see how, something that's maybe completely a little bit crazy can actually be harnessed to be a really creative and interesting idea. And so that whole field of putting genetic particles in the brain and turning them on and off with lights, that whole idea has helped us to understand how the Parkinson circuitry works, and then to guide things like deep brain stimulation and drug therapies and targets and other things, and just to understand. And the more you understand about how a circuit works, the better chance you have of treating it. And so this has led a lot of scientists to get into that area. We're behaving more like the cancer scientists, and that's a good thing, okay? And the cancer scientists and the cancer field, they are much more thinking about combinations of therapies, right? You see combinations of chemotherapies, combinations of drugs. They think more about the immune system and using the immune system for good. So the immune system protects you, but could you use it to make vaccines for things for Parkinson? Could you develop antibodies like you see in COVID? Could some of these antibodies go against bad things in Parkinson? Could you decrease and knock down when things are angry and inflamed? And so we're starting to use some of those lessons, right? And that's good, right? You want to look left and right. You don't want to be totally tunnel vision. So you want to bring in some of those lessons from cancer. Designer receptors in cancer called DREADs, these drugs designed for specific receptors, starting to see that come into the laboratory. And then lots of new advances in how we understand how those circuits communicate, listen to them, and try to build smart devices. And I saw somebody brought up AI, artificial intelligence, in the chat. Now, just remember, AI could be anything, right? To me, the computer that we're on right now, this is a technology that has been developed by artificial intelligence, but the idea that we'll be able to use some of these advances to, cull huge data sets, like the person that was asking the question in the chat is talking about, is exciting, and could we accelerate to get there faster? There are new drug targets. There are old drugs like cannabis and CBD and things that now, I see people who are, were like sheriffs and part of the, anti-drug movement, who get Parkinson and who benefit from these things, and realize, hey, look, forget about the politics. Are there receptors in the brain, and could we design drugs even based on what we know? Maybe CBD and cannabis maybe they're not even the right things, but understanding where receptors are in the brain and how we can change things. The microbiome, the nutritional therapies, knocking down inflammation, a lot of new drug targets, new drug screening. So there's just a huge number of things. But the one piece, Anissa, that really resonated with me as we wrote in the book, and I wrote a lot of at least the first drafts on a lot of these chapters about the therapeutics and things. What resonated with me was that when we looked historically at other diseases, to move the needle, like in HIV, it took $3 billion a year. And you saw, to move the needle in COVID, to get an operation warp speed, it takes a certain amount. And so if I say to everybody on the call, I'm going to give you $250 million every year for Parkinson's disease, everybody might cheer, like on this call, and say, that's awesome, Dr. Okun, awesome, like $250 million. But the reality is, it's not awesome. It's not anywhere close to where we need to move the needle. We're going to need 2 to 3 billion. We're going to need an increase of at least 10 times. And so when we came up with the red card campaign to send red cards to the White House, you'll notice one of those 3 messages, those 3 resonant messages, was born from the book and from all the research, and from taking a 50,000 foot view of the research. It's not so much what we're doing, it's how we're doing it, and we're not doing enough of it. So you have researchers even now this morning on Twitter fighting about, like, oh, we shouldn't put any money into neuroprotection. We don't know enough about that now. We should, because, they're fighting over the peanuts that are there. And we shouldn't be doing that, and I try to remind them of that. Like, all these ideas are good. The majority of all ideas in medical science fail, but you have to have enough of those ideas and enough synergism and enough conversation to make something, grow. And so the idea of the pact, prevent, advocate, care, and develop new treatments, the last part of the pact that we talk about in the book is this, this acceleration of therapies. We've got a lot of good people, but if you had $250 million or $200 million in Parkinson, and we even doubled that every year, and we started doubling that every year, maybe we would get almost twice as many kids into this business. You're going to get there faster, right? If you had 10 times the number of kids, working on it, 10 times the number of ideas, and maybe the failing idea gives the investigators and the group the winning idea because they see why something failed. And so the other lesson I would say to everybody listening today is, when you hear about failures in science are awesome. Let me say that again. Failures in science are awesome because they make you think about why it failed. And you have to invest in failures. This isn't like you're trying to make money and retire in your 401k, right? The compound interest here is in taking all these failures, understanding what the system is doing, and eventually turning it into the success. So in science, failures are what you're looking for, as long as people are thoughtful about why they're failing and you keep having that conversation. That's what's going to move the field forward. So I became more, as we wrote in this section, Anissa, I became more, I don't know if I would say enlightened. I feel like I'm more enlightened, but maybe a bit more 50,000 foot view of where we need to be. And it's moved me out of the comfort zone of everything needs to be perfect to, like, we really need to get more and accelerate more into this area if we're gonna move the needle for these people that need it.
So you referenced the Give a Dime, the Red Card Project. Did you get any feedback from that much?
Yeah, so the feedback we have so far, well, so the group, the PD Avengers led by the GIF, Larry Gifford, up in Vancouver. So that has been like an honor of a lifetime to see this group, of people begin to get together, converge their voices. And so I think in general, the feedback we're getting is this complicit silence that we have, and I call it almost like a stunned silence. So we all get Parkinson, more people are getting Parkinson, we get discouraged and we become silent, And so the red card has really gotten people to not be silent, to get away from that construct of silence, because it's kind of like when you don't know what's going on, you're confused, you're upset, things suck, you become silent, right? You can see it in people around you. And so we have to wake everybody up in the field. And so I think that has been really successful at doing just that. And talking to Ray Dorsey, there's been more of a conversation now between the White House and the lawmakers and the advocates. And Ted Thompson talked to you all here in this group as part of this. So there's an ongoing conversation about just these things, and about pushing in 10 times more, about paraquat, about all of these things. Have we gotten Jen Psaki on the stage during the press briefing to hold up the red card and say, let's go America? We know we haven't gotten there yet. Have we gotten Joe Biden to hold up the card yet and say that? No, but we haven't given up either. And I think a lot more people are on board than before. So I think it does take time and it takes dedication, but there is an inflection point, which is defined by a change in direction. That's what inflection means. And in my mind, like maybe some people think we've reached an inflection point. I don't think we're there yet. It's going to take everybody on this call and all the family members and everybody to converge around a few things. Maybe it's increasing funding by 10 times. Maybe it's banning chemicals like paraquat. Maybe it's telemedicine. But if we end the silence and converge on a few things, I think we hit an inflection point, and I don't think we're there yet.
So we only have a few more minutes left. With that in mind, what would you like to say to our audience in terms of moving that needle? What can we do as a community beyond, the red envelopes? What can we do actively to move that needle and not stay silent anymore?
So I think, it's a great question. I've given this a lot of thought. And, my own personal opinion is that we do a lot more in-reach than we do outreach. And that means that when we have these educational sessions and these meetings and these book clubs, we all get to know each other intimately at these events. But we have to galvanize the silent folks that are out there suffering, even people who have had family members who may not even be with us anymore, people that have family members and friends who are affected. There's so many people affected. And so, what I would say is, in writing this project and in writing on this, I've become more convinced that it's not enough for us to just congratulate each other, talk to each other in these groups and these forums, and do what I call in-reach, where we all just keep getting smarter. A small number of us keep getting smarter on the issues, but we don't move to a larger group. Where I would challenge everyone is to say, how can we motivate others to join us? The others who aren't part of this, and not say, okay, just because you're not active doesn't mean that you shouldn't be a part of this. It's going to take the silent people on the outside to change the direction of what's going to happen. And so we have to keep talking, keep communicating, use everything that we can. Social media, our voices. We need to be obnoxious sometimes. We need to be, respectful, but maybe a little bit more, in your face and aggressive and charismatic, because we're just not getting enough of that critical mass so we could see that inflection point. So I would challenge everyone on the call today to think about that and to think about how important it's going to be to enlist more people, because at some point in the future, we're going to hit a tipping point. And you're going to look back and you're going to say, why couldn't it have been June 25th, 2021? Like, why can't we have the tipping point today when you hit that tipping point? And if that tipping point is in 10 years, you're going to look back and say, we could have had that tipping point 10 years ago if a number of us had gotten together, if we had gotten enough people on board. And so that would be what I would want people to, this is a book club. So I want people to think about that. I want to leave you with that lingering thought in your brains.
All right. This has been fantastic. I just really appreciate it. I do want to let you know that we do draw some names for 2 people to be a winner of signed copy from all the authors of this book. So today we've drawn the names of Miller Sigmund and Donna Herbert. So if you 2 are on here, if you would be willing to ping Kelly Merkel and let her know your contact information. We will make arrangements to send that to you. I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank you, Dr. Okun. This has been fantastic. I think we covered the majority of the things that's in these heavily packed 3 chapters. I appreciate your expertise, but besides that, just your compassion that you have that brings so much more to just your knowledge, and how much you obviously care about the Parkinson community. So I thank you for your time today. I thank you everyone for joining us. We do have 1 more left in this book series coming up in July with Bass Bloom, so you don't want to miss that. You got a little bit of time to read the rest of the chapters and be prepared, but I want to thank you all. If you would be willing to give the wave of gratitude to Dr. Okun and thank him so much for this amazing discussion today. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Okun. Again, thank you so much for your time. I hope the rest of you have a great Friday and a great weekend.
It's an honor. Take care, everyone.
Yes, thank you.